Welcome to Project Insight's Professional Development Series. Today's session, Leading Projects Through Pivots, Budget Cuts, and Uncertainty, is all about navigating disruption with clarity and confidence. In today's unpredictable business climate, project managers are facing pressure from every direction: budget cuts, market volatility, shifting priorities, leadership changes, and more. This session is packed with strategies to help you lead through these challenges, make better decisions under pressure, and help your team stay focused and resilient. Also remember, by attending today's session, you'll earn one free PDU. A few housekeeping notes: everyone will be on mute, but please feel free to use the chat. The PDU certificate will be mailed before the end of the week. The access link will be available at the end of today's session. You can also access this recording through the same link that you joined on today. Let me introduce our experts. We've got Steve West, who's the founder and CEO of Project Insight. For the last 2 decades, he's helped organizations centralize their project work across expanding teams and tools to streamline workflows, automate processes, and allow our customers to make accurate, data-driven decisions. And Diane Buckley-Altweis is the CEO of Core Performance Concepts, a seasoned project management expert. She's worked in many industries. She's an author, a speaker, volunteer consultant. You guys ready to get started?
Yeah, we are.
I think
Awesome.
So. Hey, welcome everybody. So today we're going to talk a lot about change, right? And I don't know if there's anybody on this webinar or in your life that isn't dealing with some sort of change today, but not all change is the same. And what we want to focus on today are the ones that are just like, the surprises, the crises, the major changes that happen in your workplace or in your day-to-day life, and how can you deal with it? I mean, we are project managers, most of us that are on this call, right? And you're going to be, it's a given. You are going to be put into a position of managing through change, and how can you best get there? How can you best succeed? So today we're going to talk about kind of 4 topics. Can't count today, can I? What are the type of changes? What's the urgency and importance of those changes? How are we going to plan for those changes? And then how are we going to respond to those changes? We all know the person that their hair goes on fire when something changes. Our job really isn't to do that, right, Steve?
Well, that's the idea, right? But I know that I sometimes can get my hair on fire and dealing with things.
I don't want hair on fire. I know though, personally, it's like, you have to get comfortable with it. My husband's on a big boat all the time. I'm not comfortable on the water. Mm-hmm. He's totally comfortable on the water. But in a technology project or things like that, and things change, I'm very comfortable with. So you have to kind of apply these concepts to whatever you're facing and recognize when you're comfortable with something or not.
Yeah.
So the first thing to your point, or to our conversation here, is what are the types of changes? And I kind of put them into 2 categories. One are controllable and uncontrollable. Controllable things are, where you have kind of some time to plan, that you're going to be getting some new technology, you want to do some process improvement. Now, a process improvement change could be something that is being planned, but it could be a really uncontrollable thing to the person that's being impacted by. But what you're trying to do is group things. It's like, is it something that I'm familiar with that I can deal with, or is it something that, pops up and I really don't have any control? And a lot of times those are at the higher level organizational change, those environmental kind of changes. We're all dealing with a lot of things out there today with just the speed of change, whether it's governmental or whether it's technology like AI. I mean, there's just a lot going on that may be out of your control.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the uncontrollable types of changes are on the rise, especially if you're in the tech industry, because although some of it can be foreseeable, with AI, but not just AI, but any kind of tech, sometimes the tech will come in and it'll do things you don't expect.
Right. Yeah, that could be. So again, try to, when you're faced with some sort of change, look at it from the perspective as, do I have control over the overall overall plan of it, or do I not have control? So
Right.
as we go through today's webinar, we're going to kind of talk about two scenarios. We're going to talk about the scenario where, an organization acquired a new company, right? And that's kind of like something you really, as an employee, probably don't have much control over it. But if Steve was going to acquire a new company, he probably has more control over it. But most of the time, you're talking about in an uncontrolled situation, company acquires a new firm.
Right, but even if you are the one making the decision or part of the control, you're the one in the control change, that doesn't mean that there aren't people in your organization that feel the uncontrolled.
So it's all your perspective, right?
Yeah.
And then from more on the controlled side, we're going to talk about a situation where you're trying to enhance a product, and the situation is where, sales are lagging, and you're being asked to help implement a new market or utilize a new market to help those lagging sales. So you're brought into that conversation and trying to, make it a little bit more controllable. So we're going to kind of use those two examples because, there's so many examples, we can get the whole webinar be very confusing. So we're going to try to keep our conversations around these types of changes, and then look at some of the strategies to that will help you be successful when those things happen. So in the case of, the company acquiring another company, for most people in an organization, that's uncontrolled. That contract has been signed, that organization is now part of your organization. And the first thing we need to do is kind of ask why, understand the why. We've had this conversation many times. The best thing you can do is say, okay, well, I could look at it as, a negative thing, or I can look at it as a positive thing. But before you let your hair go on fire, let's think about what is the purpose and why is the company wanting that change? A lot of times the initial thought people have is, oh my God, am I going to lose my job? Are they displacing me? Or, this is going to be a big change and I don't like change. So some people do let their hair go on fire. But the first thing you have to do is understand why. And if maybe it's revenue growth, that could be a very positive thing.
Yeah.
Right.
In the case of an environment where, you've got lagging sales and they want to go into a new market, again, the same thing, ask why. I don't necessarily want to be in a company where I'm seeing the sales start lagging. That's a huge red flag, right? So is the company trying to do things to stabilize the organization, to, have more differentiation within the organization so that you can kind of put on a more positive outlook on what's going to happen? Have any of you ever been in a situation where something like this happened? Either you acquired a company, or you had a bad couple quarters and you had to kind of regroup?
Well, sure, definitely. Yeah, I've been in a company that was bought the other way around earlier in my career, and then but yeah, obviously running business, you have times where business ebbs and flows. In the course of this business, of course, the financial meltdown in 2009 when we were first getting going with Project Insight was kind of a deal, and then of course the COVID thing was a deal because it changed the way that changed the way we delivered some of our training, for example. So those are things that we've gone through.
So when those things happen, Steve, you were able to identify opportunities to keep the organization going, to ensure its long-term viability. And a lot of times people don't want to deal with that and they end up jumping ship. So it's really important from a leadership standpoint, whether you're the CEO of a company or you're the project lead, is understand why we're doing it and try to figure out, you work with the people around you, you don't do it yourself, figure out what it is that you need to do to achieve those goals. Right? It's, to a certain extent, it's project management 101.
I think that, and sometimes personally jumping ship is the right thing, but I actually think that most of the time that's not really the best answer, because if you're in a company that is having kind of changes, or maybe it is performance based and you're the one that helps fix it, that's creates a lot of security for you in your career, and you learn a lot too. So
yeah, absolutely can. Right. So the first thing we do then is like, what is the change? What is the change that's happening, and try to position your mindset in a more positive manner, because you're going to have people on your team and in the organization that are going to be stressing out.
Yeah.
Right? They are.
Oh yeah, I think we had a conversation on Project Insights podcast with Activision Blizzard, and they do a lot of acquisitions, right? Where they're buying other companies for their games and their tech and all of these things. And to Steve's point, if you freaked out and jumped ship, maybe you don't get that knowledge transfer from a larger company. Maybe you don't get that extra badge on your resume to say, I worked, in gaming in one of the largest organizations that's there. I think the idea of remaining calm and carrying forward is key there. So
yeah, if I go back to the company that acquires another company, one of the things that is very common that happens is the senior management level merge together, and there's usually some fallout to that. So there's usually some level of management change depending on the size of the company that's being acquired, right? So there is going to be impact. You just don't know what it is yet, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then, the next thing, as you think through the why, this is my favorite chart because this keeps me sane. Like, how important and urgent is it, right? What we don't want to be in that top left quadrant of important and urgent, because that means our hair is on fire and oh my, that would be like the takeover, right? Everything's getting thrown out. You don't want to be in that situation. You want to be in where we're talking about the not urgent, but important, meaning we have time to plan, we have time to react, we have time to review and analyze what's going on, and it's not, the end of the world. Now, do you have unlimited time? Probably not. But if most of the time you want to be sitting in this quadrant. Now, if all of a sudden, let's say on our sales example, the lagging sales is really critical, like it's dropping off the face of the planet, then it might fall into that urgent, but at least know that you're in that quadrant. You're going to respond very differently if you're in quadrant 1 versus quadrant 2. And in this particular case, we're not going to talk about quadrant 3 and 4, because 4 you don't want to do. And number 3, not important but urgent. If it's not important, why is it urgent?
Right.
Right. Well, and if you find yourself in quadrant 4 on something, that's recognizing that's a hard thing to do sometimes. We've talked about that before. Sometimes the best way to deal with a project is to stop it.
Exactly.
Or a task in a project.
So when we have big changes, it's either going to be in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2, because we know it's important. And then we just have to assess how urgent things are.
Yep.
So like I said, define it. Like, is it a crisis, right? Was it something that management had planned on? Like, it might be a surprise to you, but it may not. It might have been in the works for the last year and a half. And there's 5 or 10 other people that have been involved in those conversations. It just wasn't on your radar yet because they were keeping it close to the vest. That's very common, If it's a surprise to the organization, that might make it a little bit more urgent. Like all of a sudden, your CEO is gone and nobody knows why, right? There's been situations like that in the marketplace. If it's not a crisis and if it's not a surprise, then it's like, all right, so there has been some conversation, there has been some thought around this. Do you think they've thought through everything? What do you think, Matt? Do you think they've thought through everything?
Hopefully, I'll cross my fingers, but I'm going to assume that they have not, right? I think that,
yeah. Because the people making those kinds of decisions aren't in the lower levels of the organization that know all those nuances, right? Like I had one happen the other day where it's like, we're talking to a client and the client got promised this product and we're being told that, well, we're going to be rolling this out and it's going to be done by the end of this year. And we looked at each other like, no, not right now, but willing to put a good plan together. So, and it's only because the senior management doesn't know some of the details the people in the other layers of the organization are in, so, really, it really is important to kind of, plant your feet and understand why this is happening, what has been done to date, how do we pick up this ball and run with it in an appropriate manner within that organization. So let's compare. So I have my company that's acquired another one. Well, it's probably not urgent. Like I said, it's probably been in the works for a while. It might be a surprise to some people, because usually especially even if you're a private company, public companies, they'll keep things quiet until the deal is signed, right? I'm not expecting to be involved in those conversations. We shouldn't be expecting to be involved in those conversations unless we're asked to or we're at that level. But we do want to see what the plan is. And we want to have the opportunity to review that plan and provide some feedback. And like we said, understand that why.
Well, and I think in that context, you could, even though maybe it's not urgent, there will be things that happen during an integration of the companies that become urgent.
Exactly. Yeah. Just because the overall initiative isn't urgent doesn't mean that some steps won't be critical to happen.
Integrating systems, trying to get things to work together. Also, just the human relations part of that can turn into urgency real quick.
Oh yeah.
In the company that I'm working with right now, 3 companies in the last 4 years. So none of them have been urgent, but there's definitely approaches to, okay, well, we're not going to assimilate all the employees right away. We're going to leave the branding the way, it was. We're going to market that they're part of the company now, but start laying out some expectations as to what this means, and that's when we started getting involved. So, because you got to communicate out, right? On the lagging sales scenario, that could be pretty urgent, depending on what things are trending, right? And it could be a huge surprise. I know there's a lot of companies out there that everybody thinks that the company that they work for is never going to go away. And, right?
Oh yeah. And Sears Roebuck is the Amazon of the 1800s.
Right.
They died in the 90s, so there you go.
Right.
Yeah, but I did like Amazon. The Christmas catalog when I was a kid. We used to get that in the mail. I miss
Circle
that.
what you like. Yeah.
Tear out the sheets. This is what I want Santa to bring me. But lagging sales is a lot of times I find that people in the organization, it ends up being a surprise to them when it really shouldn't. I worked in subprime lending back in the early 2000s. So you remember what happened with the housing market back in 2005, 2007, 2008?
It was like 08.
Right.
With all the funny money.
The company that I was working for back in 03 and 04 literally thought that one product for them would be fine. They were not diversifying. They were not, and they were making money hand over fist. And then the market changed and they couldn't respond. The company's no longer around. So don't, recognize that it will be a surprise to a lot of people, but it is super important for us to pay attention to our own market where our company, financials are going, because, we don't ever want to be surprised with that. Depending on where the state of the union is, it could be pretty urgent.
Yep.
But if we're going to maybe, have a new market, enhance our products to target a new market, there's a lot of questions, right? I would have a lot of questions. But the first thing is to say, all right, how big of an issue is it? And how fast do we have to respond? The first one, that's probably already been discussed, but in the second one, it's a hard thing to understand, how big is the issue and how are we going to be able to respond quickly enough? The third part is planning, right? Now I kind of understand what it is. I understand some of the urgency. I get a framework around timing, etc., what the real issue is or issues are. And now it's time to kind of put some planning together. So whether you do a risk benefit analysis or a SWOT analysis, this is where you have to kind of put the positives and the negatives on the table and talk through them and work through them together. I always like to start with the positives, because otherwise you get people in a very somber mood if you start with the negatives. So I always like to start with the positives and figure out, well, how can we make this really work? What would be those objectives that we want to achieve that would really make this work? So if we're looking at our first scenario, it's probably a decent revenue opportunity, right? I mean, why would you acquire a company to lose market share? Right?
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't. I mean, the plan usually is to increase revenue.
Yeah. So some of these things are probably relatively obvious. I think you mentioned it a second ago, diversification, right, Matt?
Yeah. No.
Yeah. We all want our stock portfolios to be well diversified, so we aren't, dependent on one or two high risk stocks, right?
Yep. Even if it's not even high risk, just one, right? Like to your point of the one product, if it's everything's in one basket, it makes it a lot easier to get wiped out, I think.
Now, a lot of, and Steve, you can talk to this. When you started up with Project Insight, you didn't have all the features that you have today. You didn't have all that complexity you had today. You had to start with something, basic that was sellable, and then expanded from there, right? Whether you grew through acquisition and plug things together, or you grew through continued enhancements and efficiencies and features.
Yeah.
Well, you're still diversifying.
Most people know we grew through just organic. So it's always been adding clients, making features they need, and it's the same as we were in the beginning, if you think about it, other than there's more complexity because the product exists already. But in our industry and software industry, it is all about continuing innovation, because the minute you stop,
I have two questions for you, though. One is, did you consider certain companies as your competition early and then were able to compete with other companies later? So maybe as you developed your product, were you able to compete better with different competitors? And the second question is, when you started, were you targeting a certain type of business, or was it relatively generic for anybody managing projects?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, project management tends to be a little bit more broad. So in the beginning, it was our tool was mostly for anybody, especially because collaboration on the web still wasn't quite where it is now. Everybody uses the internet today, but back then, a lot of people weren't even thinking like this. So, so Project Insight has always been more broad, but there are sectors and industries that we do a lot better in, and when it comes to who uses our tool. Like, for example, we don't have a ton of home builders who do tract homes, right? So that's not a sector. I mean, maybe that sector could use our tool, but that's not
Or maybe
who
you'd have
uses
to
it.
do an
You'd have to adapt
enhancement or
it.
an acquisition to be able to
Yeah,
capture that sector,
Right.
right? If you wanted to go down that path.
yeah. And over time, the competitors change who you're up against, and obviously some tools are gone that we used to compete with. Other tools change their direction, and other tools come into the market. So luckily for us, the project management market is gigantic.
Mm-hmm.
So in work management in general, because everybody has to do it. So it's not it's pretty broad, and there's a lot of tooling out there. So
Awesome. Yeah, no,
yeah.
that's great insight. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
one other thing about that is, we learned how to integrate with things like Jira and DevOps, and not be competing against them, but being complementary to other kinds of project management tools. So
right.
that was some of those other adaptations. That was it controlled or uncontrolled? I would say that to some degree we don't control it, but it wasn't urgent necessarily, because these things evolve. It seems like they
That
evolve
would,
really fast, but not. Is AI really an urgent thing for you? Probably not. It's probably something you want to be strategic in your time in adapting, because it's not going to be the same tomorrow. Tomorrow it's going to be different than the way it is today, but certainly it's urgent that people start realizing and recognizing AI technology. But I don't think that AI tech is a hair on fire kind of thing, unless
yeah, no, we
yeah.
all need to be dabbling in it, right?
I think
And
strategically using it.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yep, yep. And from the second scenario where the sales are lagging, and then we want to enhance our product, what are some of the benefits? Again, I'm going after a new market. There's
Yeah.
definitely revenue opportunities. I would never think that a change in an organization would be there'd be any like high level negative, unless the change is we're closing the doors,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's always organizations change to be better. Now, it may impact people positively and negatively, but generally organizations want to change to be bigger and better, right? So there's
Either
always
that or
going
a
to be
more
that,
profitable. Maybe they
yeah,
don't want to grow, but they want to increase
mark
bottom
and
line.
margins, etc. I mean, there has to be some positive place that we start,
Hmm.
and you made the comment, it's a new opportunity to learn. You've
Right.
given, we might have a new market. We want to go down this path. Let's say construction, right? We want to go down the construction path. Well, you know what? We're going to have
Yeah.
to learn some new stuff, because not every industry is identical, and there's
Right.
probably some nuances that would need to address.
Hmm.
You know,
So
but
I have a question. So let's say you're a project manager, and they're in a company, or your company is acquiring another company, and you want to put this list together of risks and opportunities. What's a strategy a project manager could use to get this list and to start putting it together? I mean, besides just their own head.
no, exactly. It shouldn't just be their own head.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and they're like, "Oh, I don't feel comfortable talking to that person." And I'm like, "You're going to be the project manager on one of the largest clients we have in this organization. You should not be afraid to talk to anybody."
Yeah.
I'm like,
Right.
it's more about, okay, this is being announced. Let me ask some questions. Let me find out what the overall intent is. Do we have anything that we're able to share yet? How should we look at this? Because the folks that are either acquiring the company, the people that made that decision, or the people that are making the decision to enhance the product, have had those conversations. So there should be no shyness with regard to asking questions. And if somebody doesn't want to share that information, that's a red flag to me, right?
Hmm.
Oh, you don't need to know. That's a big red
Yeah.
flag, right?
Well, and I think too, let's say that you're a project manager, you're kind of in the middle of the organization as far as, and obviously project managers do end up interacting with the C-suite quite a bit, or the executives, and they're going to do this. and you've got your list together, but maybe an activity a project manager could do is put together things that you might have be more intimately involved with because you worked on a project to implement software A, B, and C, and you might be able to help your executives make better decisions by putting together, here's some challenges I see with, handling this XYZ system or whatever it is you're dealing with, and go show it to them.
Yeah,
In a positive way. In a positive way, though.
Absolutely. Well, and again, it's a conversation. So, like, even in a situation that I had recently, we're bringing on this new project manager for this client. We're also initiating trying to get this client that's had custom work for 8 years, and now we want to get them under kind of our standard product. All right.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, and then not the CEO, the founder says, "Oh, we'll get it done by the end of the year," and we're like looking at each other like, "No," So, but first, I start with, okay, what's the intent? Does the client understand where we're trying to go? We haven't been included in those conversations. Does the client understand where we're trying to go? Do they not understand that? And so I got feedback from the senior team, and then we talked to the actual client to validate that they're on board, right? And the conversation's different. Like when you talk internally, it's different than, talking with the client per se.
Yeah, we're going to get them to do it, and it's no matter what. And then you talk to them, and
so
maybe not so much.
So we did validate that. So that was good. So everything's good there. But the next question was, all right, how urgent is this? Right? Mm-hmm. Do we have to do it tomorrow? And senior management's like, yeah, we should do it right away because there's all kinds of benefits to this. I'm like, well, that's just not going to happen like that.
The question is it your benefit or their benefit? Whose benefit?
There is a little bit of both, which is positive, right? Both get benefit. We probably get more benefit. And you're not going to change them that fast, right? You're just not, because they're not our company. They're larger than us, so it's like, you're just not going to change them that fast. So we had to have an internal conversation about what are those challenges? Exactly what you said, Steve. What are the challenges the detail team sees, and how do we approach that? And then have that conversation with the client again, saying, you know what? I know some people said we can do it like in 3 months. You also aren't sure how we're going to do that. And I'm validating that, it's not going to be 3 months, but we are going to work to putting a plan together that we all can work on, and we all can, deliver and gain those benefits that we both agree on, so having that conversation, early on, and being open about it and honest about it. And I think transparent about it, we should always be honest. Right. But sometimes you have to share some of that transparency of what's going on behind the scenes to allow them to understand, okay, you know what, it's not going to happen in 3 months, but we're going to put a good, solid plan together to be able to show you how we can get there in a timely manner. Yeah. And,
but that was it, though, right? You picked up the ball. Everybody understood the why. You started involving who you needed to get all of the documentation in order from a SWOT or a risk or, otherwise. And then you get to come together and say, logistically, we want this to happen. We can't make this. So let's figure out a plan and put it in place so that everybody gets the outcome that they're looking for.
Because senior management basically said, so you can do this in 3 months? And I'm like,
right. Yeah.
Yes.
And then, you got to lay out the risks. So like I said, start with the positives, understand those positives, and then what are those risks and what could happen, not necessarily what should happen, what could happen. So if I'm acquiring a company, the company could be changing major direction, depending on who was acquired. It could be taking over your entire C-suite. I mean, it could be a lot of change. There could be resource impacts of bringing on a new firm. There could also be closure of existing projects because some projects are no longer in that important category. They're in that unimportant category. As the makeup of the organization changes with this acquisition. The company you're talking about, Matt, where they're constantly acquiring things, their culture is probably such that they have a model that they can repeat.
Oh yeah.
Right?
We have, I mean, that was our podcast, but we even have customers who that's often what they're doing, right? And their project plan and project insight is this, right? It's this exact process. They're doing the risks. Maybe there are projects in flight that we're developing that the company we're acquiring has it full-fledged all the way out, right? We have this on our roadmap for 2027 and they have it in existence today. So let's stop that work and, embrace what we have there. So
And if let's say it's your first time dealing with an acquisition, maybe one of your questions is, do we foresee doing this more often?
Right.
Because if the answer is yes, well, you know what? Maybe what you're doing is now going to be that template for future acquisitions. You know you're going to hit some hurdles. You could be upfront and open about, we know that we're going to hit some hurdles because this is the first time we're doing it, but let's document what we're doing. Let's identify how things went, respond as we stumble, and maybe we can build a much more efficient way to, do ongoing acquisitions.
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
Yeah.
On the lagging sales project, some of the concerns would be, do we even have the expertise? Do you have the expertise in construction, Steve? You might have to get some people, right? How big is that new market? What are the goals? And who are we competing against? And who are we trying to compete against? Because there's different levels of competition. So if let's say there's 20 competitors out there and you're just new into the market, you're not going to try to compete with the big elephant. You may try to
in
chip
software
away
they
at the
might
lower.
if they get money.
Huh?
If you get an investment, then maybe you do. It depends on.
True.
Do you even have the time, right? If it's a matter of make or break for the organization and this new market is the solution that you've come up with, is that even viable from a timing perspective?
Well, and we've had webinars about KPIs and things like this. This would be a perfect opportunity to say, I'm moving into a new market. And sometimes the project teams and the technology teams don't want to get into this. But I think it's so important. We're going into a new market. This market is a $2 trillion market. There's 5 companies out there, but 2 of them have half the market.
Yeah.
So where we want to focus and how much of that market do we want to achieve in the first 2 or 3 years so that we can show progress and results? Mm-hmm. Do you want to try to supplant the top 2 people and get, maybe to your point, if you have a big enough investment, but more than likely it's about grabbing that other 40% of the market.
Yeah. Niching down into what you're really great at is
Correct.
Usually what, if you're going to go into a new market, usually the focus should be on discrete, more narrow abilities that you're better at.
And if we can articulate that to the teams that are having to execute on that plan, they're not going to try to swallow the elephant. I mean, let's say we're not going after those big behemoths, right? So now our sales team is trying to get out there and gain sales, but they're comparing us to that big behemoth. Well, that's not a fair comparison, right?
Yeah, right.
Compete against who you're targeting to compete, and make sure that everybody understands that. And otherwise you can go down the wrong path. Mm-hmm. Resources always can be impacted when that happens too. And same thing. Some, we might be redirecting monies to some place in the organization that we got to pull monies from. Mm-hmm. And, that's the reality of these big changes, is that the monies will get redirected. There's only so many resources, dollars, and people that companies have to work on. So let's make sure that we're all aligned with the top projects for the organization and that they're important and not urgent, or important and urgent, right?
Yes.
And then lastly, once we have that plan and we understand not, you don't have to finish the plan. Once you start pulling that plan together, the important thing is constantly, communicate, make sure things are staying aligned with the people that made the decision to start down that path. Make sure you're talking with, your clients and your team members, constantly, keep them in the loop, even if it's not perfect. That's where I see a lot of people say, well, I can't say anything now. I'm like, why not? Something as simple as, oh my God, our key resource, mother passed away, right? And he's not, and it's like, people try to hide it. I'm like, why? You're just going to get beat up because you're not delivering when there's a really valid reason that things have gotten delayed. So I'm a big proponent of, sharing that and sharing in a transparent way, but not necessarily, overkill. You don't want to, open your kimono on everything, but having that honest conversation is super important. And this way, then your clients and your team members begin to trust you. And trust is the key thing in any of these things, because once your client or your team members don't trust what you're saying, these kinds of initiatives will fail really quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, basically, you're saying that it's the same kinds of things that you would do on any project, really. Yeah, it just really, I mean, the urgency is what is changing more than anything, and it highlights the importance of understanding the why. It highlights the importance of ongoing communication and making sure you are clear with regard to where you're going. Because these are important initiatives. You've acquired a team. The company needs that to be successful. They just spent money to acquire a company, right? They need that to be successful. Well, that's as a project manager, it's your job to help make that be whatever the vision of those executives. That's our jobs, is to fulfill that. But one thing I do see out there sometimes is we work with the same level of urgency regardless of the urgency of the project. Right? So people have their process and they want to follow their process, and they want to follow their process, and they want to do this. But sometimes you could back off, but sometimes you really do need to step it up. And maybe for the next 2 weeks, we're all putting in 10-hour days if we have to, with the expectation that once we get over a particular milestone or hurdle, we can back off. So I do see out there that there's a tendency to want to follow the process, and not really change from that. Well, and that's going to come off as resistance to the executives, and you don't want to project that you're resisting. Exactly. And it's like one of those, and part of the reason why that happens is because there's no clear articulation between urgent things and non-urgent things. So this is where your people's hair is on fire on something that's in quadrant 4. Yep. I mean, really? Why? Well, and this gets back to that chart. Like that just goes to show that the key here to the change is really your chart that you shared early on is finding out where is everything in the big scheme, and then work appropriately based on where it truly is. And then some companies, everything's in crisis mode, which is wrong, right? Right. You want 80% of your projects working in planned movement, might have a hiccup once in a while, a speed bump once in a while. Those are moving along fine. But then you're going to have big initiatives like this that might pop up to the top, which then you might have to slow down some of those ones over here for a little bit. But nothing should be dropping into these other unimportant areas. We shouldn't be working on anything. So if people are resisting that their project's gotten canceled, well, probably should have. Right. Probably should have. Right? Yeah. Well, you can get on a different project. Absolutely. That's
Absolutely.
better.
So we're at the end here, and I hope that, just to kind of in summary, the strategy that we're promoting here for anybody in this situation is always stay calm. Understand why something's happening. Make sure you're really clear with regard to the urgency, and then react appropriately. Not, knee-jerk reaction, not, sit back and wait reaction. You need to proactively react to the importance of the significant change that just happened with your company.
Yeah.
Right.
Those are good. That's good advice. I'm the kind of person that I jump right on it, but you do need to be strategic. So
You're probably a little bit
that
more
balance.
strategic than you admit.
He is.
Perhaps,
He is.
but if there is a problem, I want to fix it yesterday.
What Steve's good at doing, to the point we were just discussing, right, is he's not in that cruise control mindset of all of the quadrants I drive at the same speed, right? He is good at accelerating where he needs to get initiatives taken care of. And then when you have that breathing room to work as normal, right, you're dialing it back to be there. Or if you're in that Eisenhower matrix and it's not important, stop, pump the brakes, toss it, right, and move on to something that is
and I think
important.
The real trick is to get everybody on your team to be doing that themselves, right?
Right.
Not just you as the leader of your team and your project manager, but if each individual on your team has these skills, so you can share this with your team, this recording and that chart, to get them to think about those quadrants and what's going on in their projects.
Agreed.
Right.
Anyway,
well, thank you guys. This has been awesome.
If you want to slide to go to the next slide, if anybody has any questions, you can throw them in the chat, please. This is the time to grab out your phone, hit that QR code. The PDU will be sent to you before the end of the week, as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. I saw some clients out there of ours. Thank you very much for being customers.
We do have also some upcoming webinars and tutorials, as we always do, as far as that's concerned. So the next power tutorial that we'll be hosting will be on some new project views that we have in our program and portfolio as a part of Project Insight. That'll be happening just next week. In July, we have the head of our success team joining for our PDU to discuss WBSs, which will be a really exciting one. Please don't miss that. And then in July, from a power tutorial, we're going to be talking about proposal to execution workflow as far as that's concerned. The other part to note here is that the Project Insight Where You're Caped to Work podcast Season 2 dropped last week. Please give that a listen to. It's a wonderful episode, especially if you are like Steve and myself and kind of a space nerd. Really good one. We had conversation with the project manager from NASA. The episode 2 of Season 2 will be out next week. So look out for that in your favorite place that you listen to your pods. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.